Okay, so there are two things in this video that we want to discuss. The first thing we want to talk about is the idea of subculture, and in particular the greaser subculture, and make sure we're really clear on the types of background and character traits and etc. that we see with Ponyboy and the gang. The second thing we'll talk briefly about then at the end is the symbolism chart that you're going to be doing for homework. So let's begin with greaser subculture. Okay, and obviously what we always want to keep in mind as we explore some of these other topics and as we're reading the book is we want to keep in mind these big ideas: identity, individuality, cliques, stereotypes, gangs, race, social class, and then overall culture. Obviously, the word culture becomes really important to this idea of a subculture. So let's explain first and foremost what what a subculture is, and then what exactly is the greaser subculture. So what is a subculture? Okay, so first of all, we have to understand what a culture is. So a culture, right? The culture of a place. So, for example, the United States, the culture is that place's beliefs, traditions, values, interests, style, fashion, principles, the way people wear their hair, the way that they communicate, their ideas, their religions. Okay, so we have to understand what culture means first and foremost. A subculture is a group within a culture that tries to separate itself. So this group tries to go against the larger culture, or what we call the mainstream. Okay, within this culture, this subculture is going to have their own beliefs, their own traditions, their own values, the things that they're interested in, the way that they wear the way they wear their hair, maybe the way that they dress, how they act towards one another, the way they communicate. You get the idea. So the subculture is a smaller culture, and it goes against the main culture. The greaser subculture is quite an interesting one in many ways. Number one is because of its longevity, and secondly, because of its impact. So the greaser subculture originated in the 1950s and 1960s in the eastern and southeastern parts of the United States. Now, you have to understand, in the 1950s, the United States was just coming off of World War II. The United States of America in the 1950s and the late 1940s was very, shall we say, very average and very bland. There was sort of conformity. There wasn't a lot of individuality. Because of everything that happened over the course of the war and throughout the world, people just wanted to do things the way that they were supposed to do things and how they were supposed to do things. Now, that started to change with this subculture. So within that, white picket fence American culture, we started to see this subculture of greasers, which is what they became called, start to pop up. These young people were predominantly white. They came from the working class group, so middle class and then maybe upper lower class. The thing that really stood out about this ethnic working class group is that they were poor. They were not necessarily, super rich. They did not have access to good schools and education. They lived in poor neighborhoods, which we'll talk about. So this was a group of people who wanted to get away from the cookie cutter white picket fence type of idea and started to sort of form their own subculture within our U.S. culture. Over time, this subculture, though, became very popular with the teenage groups. What we see is that these teenagers were usually, to be fair, neglected and misunderstood teens. They came from maybe a bad family background, something tragically happened in their families. So, for example, mother and father were killed in an auto car accident. They were misunderstood. Ponyboy, for example, being very intelligent but not being understood by the socials would be an example of that, because they couldn't believe that a greaser could be that smart. So this subculture became a form of rebellious expression, and these young people in particular wanted to separate themselves from the mainstream. These young people then, over time, they got two names. The first name that they got, which we see in the novel, is Greaser. Now we have to understand the history of this word. Just like any other racial slur, there is history. So this is a derogatory term that was first used to describe workers who greased the wheels of cattle and mule cars. This was not a compliment. Okay? This term also comes from the Greaser Act of 1855, which enabled and supported discrimination of those from Mexican and Native American descent. So this literally was an act in the history of the United States that allowed discrimination against these two backgrounds. Okay. Later on in the 1950s and 1960s, these young teens who were rebelling against the mainstream culture started to become started to be called greasers, because one of their traditions, their style, was this greasy hair, right? This thick, greasy hair that they use these gels and these pomades and these oils on. So they started to be called the same derogatory term that these Mexican and Native American people were called back in the 1850s. The other name that they started to be called was hoods. Again, this is another term for the greaser subculture, and this referred to the poor, low, socioeconomic neighborhoods that many of the subculture came from. So this was actually a term that was directly related to their socioeconomic status and the neighborhoods that they lived in. Common characteristics of the greaser subculture. So like any culture, they had their own traditions, their own beliefs, their own senses of style, things that they listened to and did. So boys, a typical greaser boy would have greased hair. Black leather jackets were very common. Tight white shirts, blue and black jeans, boots or tennis shoes. They loved to wear the Converse Chuck Taylors, and they would wear leather gloves. Girls would wear tight sweaters, tight jeans and skirts, big hoop earrings, and they were often seen in high heels and boots. Culturally, rock and roll was their sort of, their music. They looked at rock and roll as sort of the soundtrack of their culture. They idolized people like Elvis and Johnny Cash, Vince Taylor. They looked up to actors like Paul Newman and James Dean and John Travolta later. Okay, so the pop culture for them was very big, and they were again sort of idolizing these musical and these movie type, entertainment type people who were again against the mainstream. These traits, even though they were not true of everybody, and we would probably say that these are some stereotypes, is that greasers were wild, they were poor, they were seen as violent, they were reckless, they were seen as criminals and troublemakers. Many of them did come from poor home lives. They were also seen as uneducated or not intelligent, which we know is not true if we look at Ponyboy. Stereotypes would be that all greasers smoke, all greasers drank, all greasers experimented with drugs. That's not the case. But also, many of these young people had values. One of them being the biggest one being loyalty. They were extremely loyal, not only to each other, but also to the subculture itself. So a greaser would stick up for a greaser no matter what, ultimately, even if there was sort of a disagreement or an argument between the two of them. So Tim Shepard, for example, is at the end of the day going to stick up for Dallas Winston just because the two of them are greasers. They had a strong sense of right and wrong. They were often very black and very white. Right? So what they thought was wrong, and what they thought was okay. And you didn't really see a lot of, argument about that, or them sort of being in the middle and kind of being gray. Again, they had strong morals and values. They were very family oriented. Actually, many of them looked at this idea of these gangs as families. And last but not least, they disregarded other classes. So they were very exclusive. If you were not someone from their neighborhood or from that socioeconomic status. Let's say you were an upper class kid from the West Side who had a rich family. Greasers were not going to let you be greasers. So they disregarded each other, but at the same time had a strong sense of loyalty to each other. Right? They disregarded other classes, but had a strong sense of loyalty to each other. So the interesting thing about this subculture, and here's a couple pictures, you can see some of the young girls and the young boys, is that this is even, if you look at some of these styles and you think about the music that they listened to of the time, A lot of this is still around today. You know, we've seen the black leather jackets, we see the sunglasses, we see, you know, young women, for example, sometimes dressing similar to these pictures that you see here. So this is not a style that's kind of in a subculture that has disappeared completely. This is a subculture that even today is still around, and we see this even still in mainstream pop culture, where you know you see movies and you see famous celebrities dressing like this even still today. So the great thing about this greaser subculture is it still has an impact today. You know, we see movies like Grease. We see movies like The Outsiders and books being written like Rumblefish, right, about this subculture. So this has had a big impact on our culture, our pop culture in particular, and continues to be um, a huge subculture even today. Okay, so that wraps up our greaser subculture, and hopefully that gives us a better idea of who these people were, especially the ones in the book. Okay, the next thing I'd like to explain to you just quickly, this is pretty much common sense here, is the outsider symbolism chart. Okay, so as we've discussed, a symbol is an object, character, setting, or action that stands for something much bigger than it is. For example, a sword might symbolize the war, a flower might symbolize beauty, and these symbols represent major thematic ideas in the story. And understanding symbols obviously then helps us to bring a much deeper meaning of the piece and really explore the piece's theme. One of the things that makes The Outsider such a great story, besides the fact that it's a great story, is S.E. Hinton's use of symbols throughout The Outsiders. So we want to consider how they are contributing to the characters, to the conflict, and to the theme. So we've already kind of done this with the characters, where we're looking at the characters as symbols. Now we want to look for the obvious symbols, the objects, the settings, etc., that S.E. Hinton is using. So what I've given you is I've given you this document. You can see that there are 2 pages. Here's the first page, and then here is the second page that is blank. This chart is going to be collected with your portfolio, so please make note of that this becomes a part of the portfolio. It must be included, so please make sure you do note that. Okay, what I've done for tonight's assignment is I have given you 3 of the major symbols in the novel. Okay, so for example, and the 3 I've given you, and these are not the only 3, but these are the 3 that we're going to start with today. As I've given you the greaser hair, the sunsets, and then the blue Mustang. Okay, what you need to do in the second column is you need to have a quote which includes a reference to the symbol. May not say greaser hair exactly, but it might be a quote that is about somebody's hair. And then you need to explore the symbolism of the symbol. So what do you think it symbolizes? So I've given you the blue Mustang. I've given you a quote there from page 30 that includes the blue Mustang in it. And then when we think about the blue Mustang and the fact that Bob Sheldon, the Soch, is the one that drives it around, there's a couple things that pop up. So the blue Mustang, is it really just a blue Mustang, or does it mean something much bigger? So the blue Mustang symbolizes things like fear. Johnny was deathly afraid of that car every time he saw it, right? That fear also gave Bob Sheldon power over Johnny. It's a source of violence because, as we see in the story, violence to Johnny, and then also the violence that ultimately happens to Bob Sheldon, occurs with the blue car referenced. And then it's also a symbol of social class and wealth, because obviously a greaser like Ponyboy or Johnny was not going to be able to afford a car like the blue Mustang. So what we're asking you to do is take a look at the first 2, greaser hair and the sunsets, and then since I've given you the third one, we're going to ask you to come up with a third one on your own. So in this box right here, these boxes right here, you'll think of a symbol on your own, come up with a quote, and then think about the thematic ideas. You need to have at least 3 thematic ideas for each symbol, and a reminder that this chart is now part of your portfolio. Okay? If you have any questions, again, as always, let me know. Check out the video and get in touch if you have any questions. Thanks.